Hello, and welcome to NMA Newsmakers. I'm Jamie Caswell with the National Mining Association. Today I'm talking with Jeff Holmstead, former Assistant Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for Air and Radiation, and one of the nation's leading climate change lawyers who heads the Environmental Strategies Group at Bracewell and Giuliani. Today we'll be discussing climate change, fossil fuels, and the impact of proposed EPA regulations on businesses and consumers. Good morning, Jeff, and thank you for being with us today. As a former senior EPA official, how would you characterize the balance that is being struck between energy, the environment, and climate change in the public dialogue?
Unfortunately, a lot of the debate about climate change and fossil fuels has not been terribly thoughtful or enlightened. For example, every time there's a natural disaster of any kind, whether it's a hurricane, a flood, or a drought, environmental activists are quick to blame it on climate change and specifically on the use of fossil fuels. But you have to remember that these claims come from environmental activists, not from scientists who have studied such things. The researchers keep telling us that there's no scientific basis for claiming that any particular hurricane or cyclone is caused by climate change. And even though carbon emissions have increased substantially over the last century, it doesn't appear that there's been an increase in the frequency or the intensity of this kind of weather event. Now, this is not to say that climate change is not a serious issue. It certainly is. There are uncertainties about how much global warming will occur and about the impacts that such warming may cause, but there is cause for concern and certainly reason to look for ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The challenge is how to accomplish this goal without causing serious economic harm. The world still needs affordable, reliable electricity, but at least in the United States, the current greenhouse gas proposals from EPA are putting that at risk by pushing too far, too fast.
And what would you say to those who think the solution is simple? Just stop using fossil fuels to power our homes and businesses.
Well, I would say it's not that simple. In the U.S., about 70% of our electricity comes from coal and natural gas, about 20% comes from nuclear, and most of the rest comes from dams that produce hydropower. Wind and solar power, which seem to be the preferred options for a lot of environmental activists, have clearly become a more important part of our energy mix, but they provide only about 4% of our electricity today. And the big problem is that they are much less reliable than fossil fuel and more costly. So most energy experts do not believe that things like wind and solar will displace a significant amount of fossil fuel for the foreseeable future. You may have seen that student activists at a number of universities have been demanding that their schools divest from any companies involved in producing coal or other fossil fuels. I've actually been encouraged to see that the leadership at these universities have refused these demands and actually responded to the divestiture movement in, I think, a very thoughtful way that talks about the importance that fossil fuels play in our society. The president of Brown University, Christina Paxson, responded to student activists at that school by pointing out that coal provides needed energy for billions of people throughout the world, and that stopping production and use of coal would create significant economic and social harm throughout the world. Using coal as a cost-effective and reliable energy source in most parts of the world is the best way to lift millions of people out of energy poverty and improve their quality of life very significantly.
So then what would you propose as a possible solution to curbing emissions without hurting those in need?
Well, I believe that the answer lies in new technology. Always, as we have become aware of environmental problems, new technologies have emerged to deal with them. For example, by retrofitting older power plants with scrubbers, catalysts, and baghouses, emissions of conventional pollutants that cause air quality problems have been substantially reduced. In terms of conventional pollutants, new coal-fired power plants can be as much as 90% cleaner than the plants they replace. Now, from a technology perspective, reducing greenhouse gas emissions will be more challenging than reducing emissions of conventional pollutants, but I believe it can be done. The U.S. has always been a leader in developing and deploying advanced technologies to deal with environmental problems, and I believe that this trend will continue for global warming and global climate change, if there is a reasonable regulatory framework.
And what would be a part of a more reasonable regulatory approach?
Well, certainly not EPA's most recent proposal to regulate carbon emissions from new coal-fired power plants. As you know, EPA has issued a proposal that would require all new coal-fired power plants to install an emerging technology called carbon capture and storage, or CCS, even though this has not been demonstrated at a commercial scale at any power plant in the world. EPA itself admits that this technology would almost double the cost of building a new coal-fired power plant. This virtually ensures that none will be built if this requirement is actually put in place and upheld in court. EPA argues that companies will find ways to make this technology cheaper, and that may eventually be true, but companies say that in the meantime they will simply stop investing in new technologies for coal plants if EPA mandates a technology that is not yet ready for commercial use. We need to find a balanced regulatory approach, one that will reduce carbon emissions and create incentives for technology development without significantly increasing the cost of energy by excluding coal from the energy mix.
And what about the administration's carbon regulations for existing power plants?
Well, we still haven't seen what the administration will propose for existing power plants, but there are indications it will be pretty aggressive. If this is the case, then people who live in states like Missouri and Indiana, states that depend heavily on coal, people in these states could face a steep hike in their utility bills. Now, no one likes to pay higher power bills, but this is especially hard for the poor, the elderly, really anyone living on a fixed income. Removing coal from the energy mix would essentially be a very regressive tax that would fall disproportionately on the poor. It would also create an incentive for energy-intensive industries to locate overseas, and this would be bad both economically but also environmentally, because overseas regulations tend not to be nearly as stringent as ours. There is still time, I believe, to adopt a balanced approach if policymakers are willing to look for it, an approach that will keep affordable, reliable coal in the mix. We know that coal will continue to be used in the developing world. In most parts of the world, coal is by far the most cost-effective way to produce electricity. And here in the U.S., we need to find a way to reduce carbon emissions that won't harm states that depend on coal for a large portion of their electricity.
Thank you for speaking with us today, Jeff. That wraps up today's interview with special guest Jeff Holmstead, a former senior official at EPA and a top climate change and energy strategist at Bracewell and Giuliani. Please check back here in the near future for the next edition of NMA Newsmakers.